The transport ship bucked and shuddered as plasma bolts tore through its hull, sending Captain Marcus Chun sprawling across the deck. Emergency klaxons wailed through the corridors, while red warning lights bathed everything in an ominous glow. Through the viewport, he could see the massive Zephyrian battlecruisers closing in, their sleek obsidian hulls bristling with weapons that could reduce his merchant vessel to cosmic dust in seconds. "All hands, prepare for boarding," Marcus commanded into his comm unit, though he knew resistance would be futile. The Zephyrian Empire had been expanding aggressively for the past decade, absorbing smaller civilizations with ruthless efficiency. Earth's fledgling interstellar trade routes had apparently caught their attention. The ship lurched violently as tractor beams locked onto the hull, dragging them inexorably toward the largest Zephyrian vessel. Marcus had heard stories about their boarding parties, tall, elegant beings with crystalline skin that could shift between translucent and opaque at will, wielding energy weapons that could paralyze or kill with equal precision. What he hadn't heard much about was what happened to the captives afterward. The answer came soon enough. Zephyrian soldiers materialized through the hull itself, their advanced technology allowing them to phase through solid matter. Marcus barely had time to reach for his sidearm before a stunning blast sent him into unconsciousness. When he awoke, Marcus found himself in a crystalline cell aboard what he assumed was the flagship. The walls seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and he could feel a subtle vibration through the floor that suggested massive engines driving the ship through space. Other humans from various captured vessels occupied nearby cells, their faces bearing the same mixture of fear and resignation he felt. Days passed in a blur of basic sustenance and medical examinations conducted by emotionless Zephyrian technicians. Marcus began to notice patterns in their captivity. The Zephyrians seemed particularly interested in human physiology, taking detailed scans and samples. Some captives were removed and never returned, while others were transferred to different sections of the ship. It was during his third week of imprisonment that everything changed. Marcus was conducting his daily exercise routine in the small confines of his cell when the crystalline walls suddenly shifted, becoming completely transparent. Beyond them stood a figure that made his breath catch in his throat. She was clearly Zephyrian, but unlike any he had seen before. Where the soldiers and technicians had possessed a cold, almost mechanical bearing, this being radiated an aura of absolute authority. Her crystalline skin held a deep azure hue that seemed to shift and flow like liquid starlight. Intricate patterns of silver light traced along her tall, graceful form, and her eyes held an intelligence that was both ancient and surprisingly warm. "You are the one called Marcus Chun," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate directly in his mind. The universal translator in his ear struggled with the complexity of her language. "Captain of the merchant vessel Horizon's Edge." Marcus straightened, meeting her gaze despite every instinct telling him to look away. "I am. And you are?" Something that might have been amusement flickered in her luminous eyes. "I am Empress Zarathustra, sovereign of the Zephyrian Empire. Your defiance in the face of certain defeat has been noted." The implications of standing before the ruler of an empire that spanned dozens of star systems should have been overwhelming. Yet Marcus found himself oddly calm. Perhaps weeks of captivity had numbed his capacity for further shock, or perhaps there was something in her presence that demanded honesty rather than fear. "Defiance seems to be one of the few things you haven't taken from us yet," he replied. Zarathustra stepped closer to the cell barrier, her expression thoughtful. "Tell me, Captain Chun, what do you know of Zephyrian reproduction?" The question was so unexpected that Marcus blinked several times before responding. "Nothing. Why would I?" "Because it is both the source of our empire's strength and its greatest weakness," she said, her tone taking on an almost contemplative quality. "We reproduce through a process your scientists would call parthenogenesis. Essentially, we clone ourselves. Each new generation is an exact copy of the parent, carrying forward their memories, their skills, their limitations." Marcus frowned, trying to understand why she was sharing this information. That sounds like it would create a very stable society. Stable, yes, but also stagnant. The patterns of light beneath her skin pulsed more rapidly. For millennia, we have conquered worlds and absorbed technologies, yet we ourselves remain unchanged. We are what we have always been, no more, no less. Each generation faces the same challenges with the same responses, achieving the same results. The weight of her words began to settle over Marcus. But humans reproduce differently. Indeed, your genetic diversity, your capacity for adaptation and innovation, your ability to produce offspring that surpass their parents, these things fascinate our scientists, and they terrify our generals. Zara THYSS moved even closer until only the energy barrier separated them. I have been studying your species since we first encountered you. Your individuals display remarkable variation not just in appearance, but in thinking, in problem-solving, in emotional response. So you've been collecting us like specimens, Marcus said, anger beginning to build in his chest. Some of my subordinates, yes. But I have a different purpose. The Empress raised her hand, and the cell barrier flickered and died. I wish to understand you personally, Captain Shun. Your psychological profiles indicate an unusual combination of tactical intelligence and emotional depth. You maintained crew morale during impossible circumstances, made decisions that saved lives even when victory was impossible, and now face the unknown with courage rather than despair. Marcus remained still as she stepped into his cell, though every instinct screamed at him to either attack or flee. Neither would accomplish anything against a being who could apparently walk through walls. What exactly do you want from me? Conversation, initially. Companionship, perhaps. Zara THYSS seemed to consider her words carefully. I have ruled an empire for 3 centuries, Captain. I have commanded fleets that reshaped star maps and made decisions that determine the fate of entire civilizations. Yet I am, in many ways, more isolated than you were in this cell. Every Zephyrian I encounter is fundamentally similar to myself. We think alike, we react alike, we dream alike. You represent something entirely new. The honesty in her voice was unmistakable, and Marcus found his anger fading into something more complex. You're lonely. Is that what you would call it? She tilted her head, the gesture remarkably human despite her alien features. Your emotional vocabulary is far richer than ours. We experience satisfaction at achievement, frustration at obstacles, curiosity about unknowns. But loneliness, wonder, hope, these are concepts we understand intellectually but cannot truly feel. Marcus studied her face, noting the subtle expressions that played across her features. Yet you seem to feel them now. Since our first encounters with humans, yes. It is disturbing to my advisors. They believe contact with your species is having an adverse effect on our psychological stability. A sound that might have been laughter escaped her lips. They are probably correct. The conversation continued for hours, ranging from philosophy to military strategy to the simple details of daily life. Marcus found himself genuinely intrigued by this being who commanded star systems, yet seemed hungry for the most basic human interactions. Zara THYSS asked countless questions about Earth culture, human relationships, the concept of family bonds that extended beyond genetic necessity. As their meetings became a regular occurrence, Marcus began to understand the true scope of Zephyrian existence. They were a highly advanced civilization, but one trapped by their own perfection. Every individual possessed the same accumulated knowledge and abilities as their predecessors, creating a society where innovation was rare and true progress nearly impossible. They conquered other species not out of malice, but from a desperate need to encounter something different, something that might spark the evolution they could not achieve on their own. My advisors believe humans represent a contamination, Zara THYSS explained during one of their evening discussions. They fear that prolonged exposure to your unpredictability will compromise our efficiency, our unity of purpose. And what do you believe? Marcus asked, leaning back against the crystalline wall of what had become more of a private chamber than a prison cell. I believe they are absolutely correct to be afraid, she replied, her skin patterns shifting to deeper blues and purples that he had learned indicated strong emotion. And I believe that fear is precisely why we need to understand your species better. Even if it changes you, especially if it changes us. Zarathustra turned to face him fully, her luminous eyes reflecting depths he was only beginning to fathom. I have spent 3 centuries being exactly what I was designed to be, a perfect ruler for a perfect empire. But perfection, Captain Chun, is another word for death. Nothing perfect can grow, can adapt, can become more than it is. Marcus felt something shift between them, a recognition that went beyond their obvious differences. So what happens now? Now, she said, moving closer until her alien warmth filled the space between them. I make a choice that will either save my empire or destroy it. And I find myself hoping you will choose to help me. The implications of her words hung in the air like a challenge to everything both their species believed about themselves. Marcus Chun had come aboard this ship as a captive, a specimen to be studied. Now he found himself at the center of a decision that could reshape the balance of power across the galaxy. As he looked into Zarathustra's eyes, seeing not the cold authority of an empress, but the vulnerable curiosity of someone discovering what it meant to hope, Marcus realized that his choice had already been made. The question was whether either of their species would survive the consequences. The crystalline walls around them pulsed with soft light, as if the ship itself were responding to the momentous shift in its mistress's plans. Outside the viewport, stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to the small decisions of mortal beings that would echo across the cosmos for generations to come. Marcus Chun, captain of a destroyed merchant vessel and unwilling guest of an alien empire, had just become the most important human in the galaxy. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or pray, so he settled for extending his hand toward the being who had chosen to trust him with her empire's future. Then, let's change the galaxy, he said simply. Zarathustra looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment before reaching out with her own crystalline fingers to complete the contact. The moment their skin touched, both of them felt something impossible. A spark of connection that transcended species, a promise of transformation that would ripple through the stars themselves. The Zephyrian Empire had conquered hundreds of worlds through superior technology and unified purpose. But it was about to face its greatest challenge not from external enemies, but from the radical idea that perfection might be less valuable than the messy, chaotic, wonderful possibility of growth. And at the center of it all stood an alien queen and a human captive, about to discover what it truly meant to build something new from the ashes of everything they had once believed. The Imperial Council chamber stretched before Marcus like a crystalline cathedral, its walls rising hundreds of feet into a dome that seemed to capture and amplify starlight from the void beyond. 12 figures stood arranged around a circular platform where he and Empress Zarathustra waited, their forms so perfectly identical that Marcus had to concentrate to tell them apart. These were the High Arbiters, the governing body of the Zephyrian Empire, and their displeasure was palpable in the way their skin patterns flickered with agitated crimson light. "This is unprecedented," declared High Arbiter Vexhan, his voice carrying the weight of millennia of tradition. "No alien has ever been granted access to Imperial strategic discussions, much less been consulted on matters of succession." Marcus stood beside Zarathustra, acutely aware of how his simple human clothing contrasted with the elaborate ceremonial robes worn by the Zephyrians. 3 months had passed since their first conversation, 3 months during which the Empress had gradually introduced him to the complexities of ruling an interstellar empire. What had begun as philosophical discussions had evolved into something far more significant. "The precedent," Zarathustra replied calmly, "is exactly what we need to establish. For too long, we have allowed tradition to substitute for wisdom." High Arbiter Kesera, whose patterns glowed with particularly intense disapproval, stepped forward. Your Imperial Majesty, with respect, this human has clearly influenced your judgment in ways that compromise your effectiveness as our leader. The psychological contamination we feared has come to pass. Marcus felt the urge to defend himself, but HFY had coached him on the importance of timing in Zephyrian discourse. Instead, he remained silent and observed, noting how each arbiter's bioluminescent patterns revealed their emotional state to anyone trained to read them. Psychological contamination, HFY repeated, her own patterns shifting to the deep blue that indicated controlled anger. Is that what you call the first genuine innovation in our strategic thinking in over 2 centuries? She activated a holographic display that showed the current state of the Empire. Hundreds of star systems glowed in Zephyrian blue, connected by trade routes and patrol corridors that had remained essentially unchanged for generations. Look at our expansion pattern, honored arbiters. Notice anything troubling? High Arbiter Thermon, one of the younger council members at barely 50 years old, spoke hesitantly. Our growth rate has slowed significantly over the past century. Correct. And why? Zarathustra gestured to Marcus, who stepped forward as they had rehearsed. Because you're encountering the same problems your predecessors did, Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly in the crystalline acoustics of the chamber. Every generation faces the same challenges with the same solutions, achieving the same limited results. You're not expanding slower because the galaxy is running out of conquerable systems. You're expanding slower because you're not adapting to what you encounter. The Arbiter's patterns flashed with indignation, but High Arbiter Vexon raised a hand for silence. Explain. Marcus activated a secondary display showing recent military encounters. 3 weeks ago, your 4th Fleet engaged the hegemony forces in the Altair system. Your tactical analysis predicted easy victory based on technological superiority. Instead, you fought to a stalemate because the hegemony had adapted tactics specifically designed to counter Zephyrian battle strategies. Their innovations were crude. High Arbiter Kessera protested. Desperate improvisation. Maybe, but they worked. Marcus highlighted several key engagements. Your fleets have been using the same tactical doctrines for 300 years. Every enemy you face has had time to study your patterns, develop countermeasures. You're losing the advantage of predictability and gaining none of the benefits of adaptability. Zarathustra moved to stand beside the hologram, her presence commanding attention from every arbiter. Captain Chun has spent the past months analyzing our military records, our diplomatic protocols, our expansion strategies. His observations have identified 17 critical areas where our adherence to traditional methods has actively hindered our objectives. And you trust the analysis of a primitive alien over the accumulated wisdom of our greatest minds? High Arbiter Dexnil's patterns pulsed with barely controlled rage. I trust the analysis of an intelligence that approaches problems from angles we literally cannot conceive, Zarathustra replied. That is precisely the point. We need perspectives that our genetic homogeneity makes impossible. Marcus sensed the moment had come for the revelation they had been building toward. Which brings us to the real reason you're all here today. The chamber fell silent except for the subtle harmonics generated by the crystalline walls. Every arbiter's attention focused on their empress, waiting for words that would either vindicate their fears or force them to reconsider everything they believed about their civilization. I intend to bear a child, Zarathustra announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. And I intend for that child to be genetically human as well as Zephyrian. The explosion of light patterns from the arbiters was like an aurora of outrage. Several began speaking simultaneously, their voices creating a cacophony that made the chamber's acoustics work against them. High Arbiter Vexon's commanding presence finally restored order. Imperial Majesty, he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. What you propose is not merely unprecedented. It may be biologically impossible, Our xenobiology teams believe otherwise, HFYSS replied calmly. Dr. Zephyar's research indicates that with proper genetic engineering, human DNA can be integrated with our own reproductive process. The resulting offspring would possess the adaptability and innovation of human cognition while retaining our longevity and technological aptitude. High Arbiter Kessera stepped closer, her patterns now showing deep purple that Marcus had learned indicated profound disturbance. Even if such a thing were possible, the implications are staggering. You would create a being that is neither fully Zephyrian nor human. What claim would such a creature have to the imperial throne? Every claim, Zarathustra said firmly, because that creature would represent the evolution our empire desperately needs. A ruler capable of thinking beyond our limitations while retaining our strengths. Marcus watched the arbiters process this information, noting how their patterns revealed the internal struggle between genetic programming and logical analysis. They were designed to value stability and tradition above all else, yet they were also intelligent enough to recognize the strategic advantages Zarathustra was describing. The risks are enormous, High Arbiter Thermon said quietly. If this hybrid offspring proved unstable, dangerous, or incompetent, the damage to imperial legitimacy could be irreversible. And if we continue on our current path, Marcus interjected, the empire will stagnate into irrelevance within a few centuries. You'll be overtaken by younger civilizations that can adapt and innovate. I've seen it happen to human empires throughout history. High Arbiter Dexnil's patterns flashed with sudden interest despite his obvious displeasure with the entire discussion. What human empires? Marcus activated another display, showing historical data he had compiled during his months of research. The Roman Empire lasted over 1,000 years, but fell partly because it couldn't adapt to changing military technologies and social conditions. The British Empire collapsed when other nations developed capabilities that matched or exceeded theirs. Even smaller examples, corporate dynasties, political movements, technological paradigms, they all follow the same pattern. Dominate through superiority, maintain through tradition, fall through stagnation. But some survived these transitions, High Arbiter Vexon observed. Yes, the ones that were willing to change, to incorporate new ideas, to risk short-term instability for long-term growth. Marcus gestured to Zarathustra. Your Empress isn't proposing to abandon Zephyrian strength. She's proposing to enhance it with human adaptability. The debate continued for hours, with each arbiter raising concerns that range from practical logistics to deep philosophical questions about identity and legitimacy. Marcus found himself impressed by their intellectual rigor, even as he was frustrated by their resistance to change. These beings had ruled star systems for centuries by being extremely good at what they did. The problem was that what they did no longer matched what they needed to do. As the discussion wound down, High Arbiter Vexon posed the question that had been hanging unspoken in the chamber's crystalline air. Assuming this is biologically possible, and assuming the resulting offspring proves stable and capable, what assurance do we have that this hybrid will identify with Zephyrian interests rather than human ones? Zarathustra and Marcus exchanged glances, a moment of communication that had developed over their months of collaboration. Because, Marcus said, the child will be raised with the best of both heritages. Zephyrian discipline and wisdom, human creativity and adaptability. Most importantly, they'll be raised to see the universe as a place of infinite possibility rather than a collection of problems to be solved with predetermined methods. You speak as if you intend to be personally involved in this upbringing, High Arbiter Kessera said, her tone carrying implications that made Marcus's chest tighten. I do, he replied simply, because this isn't just about creating a genetically superior ruler. It's about proving that different species can not only coexist, but can create something greater than either could achieve alone. The silence that followed was profound. Marcus could see the arbiters processing not just the practical implications of what he had said, but the deeper philosophical challenge it represented. Their entire civilization was built on the premise that Zephyrian perfection was the highest possible achievement. He was proposing that perfection itself might be a limitation rather than a goal. Finally, High Arbiter Vexon spoke. This decision could reshape the fundamental nature of our empire. Such a choice cannot be made hastily or without extensive consultation with our finest scientists, philosophers, and strategic planners. Agreed, Zara THYSS replied. I propose a formal evaluation period of 6 months. Full xenobiological assessment, strategic analysis, psychological evaluation of all parties involved. If the Council concludes that the risks outweigh the potential benefits, I will abandon this course of action. And if we conclude that the risks are manageable. High Arbiter Thermon asked. Zara THYSS's patterns shifted to the golden hue that indicated absolute determination. Then, we will take the first step toward ensuring that the Zephyrian Empire not only survives but thrives for millennia to come. We will prove that evolution is not something that happens to a civilization. It is something a civilization chooses to embrace. As the Arbiters filed out of the chamber, their patterns revealing the turmoil of beings forced to confront the possibility of fundamental change, Marcus found himself standing alone with the most powerful being in known space. The weight of what they had just proposed settled over him like a mantle of responsibility he had never asked for but couldn't refuse. Do you think they'll agree? He asked quietly. Zara THYSS moved to the great window that showed the stars beyond, her reflection creating a double image in the crystalline surface. Some will. Others will fight this until their last breath. But that doesn't matter as much as you might think. Why not? She turned back to him, and in her luminous eyes he saw the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that kept him awake at night. Because for the first time in 3 centuries of rule, I've made a decision based not on precedent or probability, but on the belief that something wonderful might be possible. That alone has already changed our empire more than any conquest ever could. Marcus moved to stand beside her at the window, looking out at the vast tapestry of stars that represented both challenge and opportunity. Somewhere among those distant suns were worlds that had never heard of either humanity or the Zephyrian Empire. In 6 months, they might be the subjects of a civilization bold enough to redefine what it meant to evolve. The future had never been more uncertain or more full of promise. Dr. Zephyar's laboratory occupied an entire section of the Imperial Research Facility, its walls lined with biogenetic scanners, molecular assemblers, and quantum computers that hummed with the power of a small star. Marcus stood on an examination platform while dozens of sensor arrays mapped every aspect of his physiology, from his neural pathways to the quantum signatures of his DNA. 6 months had passed since the council session, and the evaluation period had yielded results that surprised even the most optimistic projections. Remarkable, the chief xenobiologist murmured, her crystalline fingers dancing over holographic displays that showed the genetic comparison between human and Zephyrian templates. The compatibility is far greater than our initial model suggested. Your species' adaptive mechanisms actually complement our stability protocols in ways we never anticipated. Zarathustra stood nearby, her patterns glowing with barely contained excitement as she studied the data streaming across the laboratory's displays. Show him the projection models, Doctor. Dr. Zephyara activated a larger hologram that materialized between them, showing a 3-dimensional representation of genetic sequences intertwining like luminous ribbons. Captain Shun, what you're seeing is a theoretical genetic map of your potential offspring. The human adaptability genes would be enhanced by Zephyrian longevity factors, while our cognitive stability will be enriched by your species' creative neural pathways. Marcus watched the swirling patterns of light, each strand representing possibilities he could barely comprehend. What does that mean in practical terms? It means, Dr. Zephyara replied with the enthusiasm of a scientist on the verge of a breakthrough, that the resulting individual would likely possess enhanced problem-solving capabilities, improved pattern recognition, accelerated learning capacity, and, most significantly, the ability to generate genuinely novel solutions to complex challenges. Everything we hoped for, Zarathustra said softly, moving to stand beside Marcus on the platform. A mind that can think beyond our limitations while retaining our strengths. The laboratory doors dilated to admit High Arbiter Vexhan, his patterns displaying the neutral silver that indicated official business. Behind him came 3 other arbiters, their presence filling the space with an air of formal evaluation. "Doctor," Vexhan said, his voice carrying the weight of imperial authority, "the Council requires your final assessment. Based on your comprehensive analysis, what is your professional opinion regarding the viability and wisdom of this proposed genetic integration?" Dr. Zephyara straightened, her pattern shifting to the deep blue of scientific certainty. "Honored arbiters, in 40 years of xenobiological research, I have never encountered a more promising opportunity for beneficial evolutionary advancement. The genetic compatibility is extraordinary, the predicted outcomes are overwhelmingly positive, and the potential benefits to our civilization are incalculable." High Arbiter Kessera stepped forward, her expression skeptical despite the scientific evidence. "And the risks, Doctor? Surely such a radical departure from our established reproductive protocols carries significant dangers." "All evolution carries risk," Dr. Zephyara acknowledged. "However, our models indicate a 94.7% probability of successful genetic integration with no adverse effects. The remaining 5.3% represents unknown variables rather than predicted complications." Marcus found himself studying the arbiters' reactions, noting how their bioluminescent patterns revealed their internal struggle between scientific logic and genetic conditioning. 6 months of intensive evaluation had provided overwhelming evidence in favor of Zarathustra's proposal, yet their fundamental programming resisted accepting such radical change. "The strategic analysis is equally compelling," High Arbiter Thermon said, activating his own holographic display. "Captain Shen's tactical innovations have already improved our fleet efficiency by 23%. His diplomatic insights have resolved 3 separate border disputes that our traditional methods had failed to address. The potential for a permanent advisor with such capabilities is significant." "More than an advisor," Zarathustra interjected. "A heir who could lead our empire into an era of unprecedented growth and adaptation." High Arbiter Vexhan's patterns flickered with the complex interplay of duty and personal conviction. "Your Imperial Majesty, the Council has deliberated extensively on this matter. We acknowledge the potential benefits, the scientific evidence supporting viability, and the strategic advantages such an alliance might provide." Marcus felt his breath catch as he sensed the crucial moment approaching. Everything they had worked toward for 6 months balanced on whatever words would follow. "However," Vexhan continued, "we must also consider the broader implications for imperial stability. What you propose would fundamentally alter the nature of Zephyrian succession, potentially creating divisions within our population between traditionalists and progressives." "Divisions that already exist," Marcus said, stepping down from the examination platform. "I've spent months studying your civilization's history. You've had faction disputes, philosophical disagreements, and strategic debates for centuries. The difference is that now you have the opportunity to channel that tension into productive evolution rather than cyclical stagnation." High Arbiter Kessera's patterns flashed with annoyance. "You presume to understand our civilization better than we do." "I understand the patterns of civilizations in transition," Marcus replied calmly. "Human history is full of societies that face the choice between adaptation and extinction. The ones that survived were the ones willing to embrace change, even when it challenged their fundamental assumptions about themselves." Dr. Zephyara moved to a new display, showing population genetics data from across the empire. "Honored arbiters, there's another factor we haven't discussed: our reproductive homogeneity. while providing stability, has also been gradually reducing our genetic diversity. Over the past millennium, we've lost approximately 3% of our original genetic variation. The silence that followed was profound. Marcus could see the implications registering on every face in the laboratory. "You're saying our perfection is making us weaker," Zara-THYSS said quietly. "I'm saying that any closed system eventually degrades," Dr. Zephyr confirmed. "We need genetic diversity to maintain long-term viability." Captain Chin's contribution would not only enhance our capabilities, but help preserve our species' fundamental health. High Arbiter Vexhan studied the data for long minutes while the others waited in silence. Finally, he spoke with the careful precision of a leader making a decision that would echo through history. "The Council recognizes the scientific merit of this proposal and acknowledges the strategic advantages it might provide. However, we cannot simply approve such a momentous change without proper safeguards and protocols." Marcus felt disappointment beginning to build, but Zarathustra's patterns remained steady, suggesting she had expected this response. "What safeguards do you propose?" she asked. "First, the genetic integration must be monitored at every stage by our finest scientists. Any indication of adverse development must result in immediate intervention protocols." Vexhan's patterns shifted to official orange. "Second, the offspring must be raised with full awareness of their dual heritage, but primary loyalty to the Zephyrian Empire. Third, succession rights must be contingent on the individual demonstrating both capability and commitment to imperial values. And fourth, Zara-THYSS prompted, sensing there was more. Captain Chun must undergo formal integration into imperial society, not as a captive or guest, but as a recognized citizen with full rights and responsibilities. If he is to be the genetic father of a potential heir, he must be a full participant in our civilization." Marcus blinked in surprise. The implications of Zephyrian citizenship had never been part of their discussions. What would that involve? High Arbiter Thermon stepped forward, his patterns showing what Marcus had learned was cautious optimism. "Full neural integration with our information networks, comprehensive education in imperial law and custom, formal recognition as imperial consort to Her Imperial Majesty, and a permanent advisory position in strategic planning." In other words, Zarathustra said, her patterns glowing with something that might have been joy, "We become partners in every sense of the word." The weight of that statement settled over Marcus like a mantle of responsibility and possibility. He had come to this ship as a captive, evolved into an advisor, and now was being offered the chance to become something unprecedented in galactic history. A human citizen of an alien empire, bound not by conquest but by choice. "The Council's conditions are acceptable," Zara-THYSS declared formally. "Captain Chun." Marcus looked around the laboratory at the assembled beings who had just offered him a place in their civilization. Dr. Zephyr's excitement was palpable in her rapidly shifting patterns. The arbiters displayed varying degrees of apprehension and hope. And Zara-THYSS, in her luminous eyes, he saw the same mixture of courage and uncertainty that had first drawn him to her. She was asking him to help her reshape an empire, to father a child who might one day rule the stars, to bind his fate permanently to beings who thought in ways he was only beginning to understand. "I accept," he said simply. The formal ceremonies took place over the following weeks. Marcus underwent neural integration that connected his consciousness to the vast information networks that bound Zephyrian civilization together. The experience was overwhelming at first, suddenly having access to the accumulated knowledge and experience of an entire empire, but gradually he learned to navigate the quantum-linked databases that contained everything from stellar cartography to philosophical treatises written by beings long dead. The citizenship ritual itself was conducted in the great chamber of the Imperial Palace, with representatives from every major world in the Empire attending either in person or through quantum-linked avatars. Marcus stood before the assembled multitude, feeling the weight of history as he spoke the words that would formally make him a Zephyrian citizen. I, Marcus Chun, formerly of Earth, do pledge my loyalty and service to the Zephyrian Empire to uphold its laws, defend its interests, and contribute to its continued prosperity and evolution. The response from the assembled crowd was mixed. Patterns of approval from progressives, neutral acknowledgement from moderates, and barely controlled disapproval from traditionalists. But the ceremony was completed, and for the first time in galactic history, a human being held formal citizenship in an alien empire. The wedding ceremony, conducted according to ancient Zephyrian tradition, was a more intimate affair. Only the high arbiters and senior scientists attended as Marcus and HFY spoke vows that bound them not just personally but symbolically to the future they hoped to create. With this union, HFY declared as her patterns glowed with pure joy, "We declare that strength comes not from purity but from harmony, not from isolation but from integration." Marcus placed his hand over hers in the Zephyrian gesture of permanent commitment, feeling the warmth of her crystalline skin against his human flesh. "Together we'll build something neither of our species could achieve alone." As the ceremony concluded and the assembled dignitaries departed, Marcus and HFY stood alone in the chamber where they had first announced their intention to challenge the fundamental assumptions of an empire. Now those challenges had become reality, and the future stretched before them, full of unprecedented possibilities. "Are you ready?" HFY asked as they walked toward the medical facility where Dr. Zephyra waited to begin the genetic integration process. Marcus considered the question seriously. Ready to father a child who might reshape the balance of power across the galaxy? Ready to help raise an heir who would face challenges neither human nor Zephyrian civilization had ever encountered? Ready to prove that evolution was a choice rather than an accident? "No," he said honestly, "but that's what makes it an adventure." Zarathus's laughter rang through the crystalline corridors like music, carrying with it the sound of hope itself. Together, they walked toward a future that neither species could have imagined alone, but both could build together. 23 years had passed since the day Marcus Chun first set foot aboard a Zephyrian battlecruiser as a captive. Now he stood on the observation deck of the Imperial Palace, watching his daughter command a fleet engagement against the hegemony forces in the Vega sector. Princess Lyra Chun, her name itself a fusion of Zephyrian tradition and human heritage, moved through the tactical display with a grace that was purely her mother's and an innovative brilliance that came from somewhere entirely new. "She's using the Kythera gambit," Marcus observed, watching the holographic representation of the battle unfold in real time. "But she's modified it with human asymmetric principles. The hegemony won't know what hit them." Beside him, Zarathustra glowed with pride, her patterns cycling through colors that had only evolved in their language since human integration began changing Zephyrian emotional vocabulary. "She sees solutions that neither of us would have conceived. Watch this next move." On the tactical display, Lyrichin's forces suddenly split into 3 groups, each taking a different approach to the hegemony defensive line. To traditional Zephyrian thinking, it looked like a dangerous dispersal of strength. To human tactical doctrine, it appeared to be an unfocused assault. But as the minutes passed, the genius of the strategy became apparent. She's not trying to break their line, Marcus realized. She's making them think in 3 different patterns simultaneously, forcing them to divide their attention beyond their processing capacity. The hegemony forces, faced with 3 apparently unrelated tactical problems, began responding with their standard protocols for each situation. But Lyrichin had designed her assault so that the standard responses would actually interfere with each other, creating a cascade of confusion that left their entire defensive matrix vulnerable. "Magnificent," breathed High Arbiter Vexhan, who had joined them to observe as future sovereign's first major independent command. "She's created a completely new form of tactical thinking. Not Zephyrian, not human, but something that transcends both." Within an hour, The hegemony forces had surrendered, their commanders baffled by an assault strategy that seemed to violate every principle of conventional warfare while achieving perfect victory. Princess Lyrichin's fleet had suffered minimal casualties while completely neutralizing a force that had been stalemated against traditional Zephyrian tactics for months. Marcus felt the communication implant in his neural cortex activate as his daughter's voice reached him across the light years between their positions. "Father, Mother, did you observe the engagement?" "We did," Zara THYSS replied, her vocal harmonics carrying warm approval across the quantum-linked communication system. "Your tactical innovation was extraordinary." "Thank you. But I have more important news than a successful battle." Even through the technological interface, Marcus could sense his daughter's excitement. The hegemony commander has requested formal negotiations, not just for a ceasefire, but for potential integration into the Empire under the new protocols we discussed. Marcus exchanged glances with Zarathustra, both recognizing the significance of this development. For 20 years, they had been implementing gradual reforms throughout the Empire, introducing human concepts of adaptability and innovation while maintaining Zephyrian stability and efficiency. The results had been remarkable: scientific breakthroughs, cultural evolution, and military innovations that had made the Empire stronger than it had ever been. But this was the first time an external civilization had voluntarily requested integration rather than simply submitting to conquest. "What terms did they propose?" High Arbiter Vexon asked, his patterns displaying the complex mixture of hope and caution that had characterized the Imperial Council's attitude toward the ongoing transformation of their civilization. Full cultural autonomy within imperial structure, shared technological development, and joint governance councils for border systems, Lyrichin replied. "They've been observing our expansion over the past decade and concluded that we're becoming something worth joining rather than simply something to be defeated by." The implications were staggering. The Zephyrian Empire had grown through conquest and absorption, forcing other species to adapt to their systems and values. What Lyrichin was describing represented a fundamental shift toward voluntary association and mutual benefit, concepts that would have been incomprehensible to traditional Zephyrian thinking. "Schedule a council session for tomorrow," Zarathustra instructed. This decision affects the fundamental nature of imperial expansion policy. As the communication ended, Marcus found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. The girl who had just revolutionized military tactics and potentially diplomatic relations was the living proof that two species could create something greater than either could achieve alone. Lyrichin possessed her mother's longevity. She would likely live for thousands of years, but she experienced time with human intensity, finding wonder and excitement in each new challenge. She had Zephyrian discipline and systematic thinking, but also human creativity and emotional depth. Most remarkably, she had developed cognitive capabilities that seemed to represent genuine evolution rather than simple combination. "She's going to change everything, isn't she?" Marcus said quietly as they walked through the corridors of the palace toward their private quarters. "She already has," Zarathustra replied. "The empire that exists today bears little resemblance to the one I inherited. And the empire she will inherit will be something we can barely imagine. Their private chambers have been modified over the years to accommodate both human and Zephyrian comfort preferences. The crystalline walls could adjust their temperature and luminosity, while furniture adapted to support both bipedal postures." It was a small example of the integration that had been taking place throughout imperial society as humans and Zephyrians learned to live and work together. Marcus activated the holographic display that showed the current state of the Empire. What had once been a collection of conquered systems linked by military force and administrative efficiency now resembled something more complex and organic. Trade routes had evolved into cultural exchange networks. Military garrisons had become joint research facilities. conquered populations had gradually become participating citizens. The council's going to have strong opinions about Lyrichan's diplomatic initiative, Marcus observed. Zara Thyss settled beside him, her patterns cycling through the deep blues that indicated contemplation. Some will see it as dangerous deviation from proven methods. Others will recognize it as the logical evolution of the changes we've been implementing. And you? She was quiet for a moment, considering her words. I see it as proof that we made the right choice 23 years ago. Lyrichan doesn't think like a conqueror or a diplomat in any traditional sense. She thinks like someone building something new. The next day's council session was as contentious as Marcus had predicted. The great chamber filled with arbiters whose patterns displayed every shade of opinion from enthusiastic support to deep concern. The integration of human perspectives had made Zephyrian politics more complex over the past decades, but also more dynamic and responsive to changing circumstances. Voluntary association represents a fundamental departure from imperial doctrine, argued High Arbiter Kessera, whose traditionalist views had evolved considerably over the years but still favored caution over innovation. How do we ensure loyalty from species that join us by choice rather than conquest? Princess Lyrichan, participating from her flagship in a Vega sector, responded with the confidence of someone who had grown up navigating between two very different ways of thinking. Honored Arbiter, conquest creates compliance. Choice creates investment. Species that join us voluntarily will contribute more effectively because they share our goals rather than simply submitting to our power. High Arbiter Thermon, now one of the senior council members, displayed patterns of cautious interest. Your Highness, what specific mechanisms would ensure that voluntary association doesn't become a source of internal division or competing loyalties? Shared governance, Honored Arbiter. The hegemony proposal includes joint oversight of border systems, integrated military commands, and collaborative research initiatives. Rather than absorbing them into our structure, we create new structures that serve both civilizations. Marcus watched the debate with fascination, noting how Lyrichan's responses incorporated concepts that would have been foreign to either human or Zephyrian thinking alone. She wasn't simply applying diplomatic solutions or military strategies. She was inventing entirely new approaches to interspecies cooperation. The long-term implications could be extraordinary. Dr. Zephyara contributed from her research facility. Princess Lyrichan's genetic heritage has produced cognitive capabilities we're still mapping. Her strategic thinking incorporates pattern recognition that exceeds Zephyrian norms while maintaining adaptive flexibility that surpasses human standards. High Arbiter Vexhan, whose patterns now displayed the deep gold of someone who had witnessed fundamental change and found it beneficial, spoke with the authority of decades of experience. The question is not whether this approach represents change, but whether it represents improvement. The princess has achieved more in 5 years of independent command than many of our finest leaders accomplished in decades. The debate continued for hours, but gradually consensus emerged around a concept that would have been unthinkable to previous generations of Zephyrian leadership. The Empire would establish protocols for voluntary association, creating a new category of membership that preserved cultural autonomy while establishing shared responsibilities and benefits. We are witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history, Zara Thyss declared as the formal vote concluded with overwhelming approval. Not an empire in the traditional sense, but a voluntary confederation of species united by shared goals and mutual respect. As the council session ended and the arbiters departed, Marcus found himself alone with his wife in the chamber where they had first announced their intention to challenge the fundamental assumptions of their civilization. The holographic displays now showed an empire that bore little resemblance to the rigid military hierarchy they had inherited. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had chosen differently?" he asked. Zara Thyss moved to the great window that looked out over the imperial capital, where Zephyrian architecture now incorporated design elements from dozens of different species. "Sometimes, but then I remember that choosing differently would have meant accepting limitation instead of embracing possibility. Marcus joined her at the window, watching spacecraft from a dozen different civilizations arrive and depart from the orbital stations that surrounded the capital world. Each vessel represented species that had chosen to associate with the Empire rather than submit to it, partners rather than subjects in an ongoing experiment in interstellar cooperation. Lyra-chun is going to face challenges we never imagined, he said, and she's going to solve them in ways we never could, Zara THYSS replied. That's what we gave her, not just our genetic heritage, but the capacity to transcend it. A communications signal indicated an incoming message from their daughter, who appeared in holographic form in the center of the chamber. Her appearance was striking, taller than most humans, but more graceful than typical Zephyrians, with skin that held a subtle luminescence and eyes that reflected depths of intelligence inherited from both parents. Mother, father, the hegemony integration is proceeding ahead of schedule. But I've received communications from 3 other civilizations requesting similar arrangements. The Altarian Republic, the Centauri Federation, and the Independent Systems Alliance all want to explore voluntary association rather than face eventual conquest. Marcus felt something he had not experienced in decades: genuine surprise at the pace of change. How many civilizations are we talking about? Potentially 17 major systems and 43 independent worlds, Lyra-chun replied. Word is spreading that the Empire offers partnership rather than domination. Species that have been preparing for defensive wars are now considering joining us instead. The magnitude of this transformation was breathtaking. The Zephyrian Empire was evolving from a conquering force into something unprecedented, a voluntary association of civilizations united by shared goals rather than imposed authority. This changes everything, Zara THYSS said softly. Yes, Lyra-chun agreed, her expression carrying the same mixture of excitement and responsibility that Marcus remembered from his wife's face 23 years earlier. But isn't that what evolution is supposed to do? As the communication ended, Marcus and Zara THYSS stood together in the chamber where they had first dared to imagine a different future for their civilizations. The daughter they had raised to bridge 2 species had instead created something entirely new. Not just a hybrid ruler, but a new form of interstellar cooperation that promised to reshape the galaxy itself. Outside the window, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, but now they illuminated not just the expanse of space, but the infinite possibility of what different species could accomplish together. The Zephyrian Empire had begun as a conquest machine and evolved into something unprecedented in galactic history. Proof that the greatest strength came not from perfection, but from the courage to grow beyond what you had always been. And at the heart of it all stood the impossible child of an alien queen and a human captive, carrying forward a legacy that neither species could have imagined alone, but both had dared to build together. The galaxy would never be the same.